Okay, everybody, we're just about to start. Julie Lewis, could you take your seat? I love bossing the boss around. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the November meeting of Schools Forum. So the first item on the agenda, apologies for absence and substitutions.
Good evening, everyone. We have apologies for absence from Susan Dillon, who's the private nursery member, from Dave Woods, a primary school member, and also Emma Appleby, primary school member, and from Tony George, who's an academy member.
Any urgent matters to be discussed? No? Matters to be considered in private? No? Declarations of interest? The minutes of the previous meeting? I'll just go through them page by page. So on the first page, any comments? Second page? Third page? Fourth page? Fifth page? Sixth page? And seventh page? No comments? We agree the minutes from the previous meeting? Thank you for that. Just to say that this is a hybrid meeting, so we have members online, and if we just follow the housekeeping protocol for people to raise their hands if they have any questions or points for discussion. So,
If I could just add, please, those in the room, if you could use the microphone so that you can be heard online. Please.
And remember to turn your microphone off when you're finished. So we move on to membership. Before we move on to membership, I just wanted to acknowledge the sad passing of Philip Portwood, who was a member of Schools Forum, who's died recently. And just to acknowledge and maybe minute that in minutes, Cornelia. Philip was, I think, a governor at John Perrin School. Unexpected, so he's sad at this time of the year. Okay. So in terms of membership, I'll hand over to Cornelia for the complex.
Just to welcome back Marion Budd in the maintained high schools category. She's been reappointed to that category with a term of office starting on the 21st of November, 2023. And Mia Pai, also in the maintained high schools category, has been reappointed with a term of office starting on the 1st of January, 2024. That's actually noted in the agenda paperwork. But after the agenda went out, Stefan Sims has also been renominated and appointed to be the representative of staff from recognized trade unions. And his term of office started on 27th of November, 2023, all of them for 3 years, term of office.
So welcome all you lucky people for rejoining Schools Forum. Okay. So moving on then to the main body of the meeting, the Schools Forum report, and I shall hand that over to Kim.
Thank you, Paul. So the report starts on page 13 of the papers, and we've taken away the confusingness of having two sets of page numbers, so you'll be pleased to see. So we've only got one set now. The purpose of this report is to advise Forum of the provisional early years schools, high needs and central services blocks for the 24-25 financial year, and to consult for on the schools block formula and seek approval from Forum for the CSP centrally retained funding, to approve the rules of the growth fund, to approve topsizing the maintained school budgets for certain education functions, to approve dedelegation of certain areas of expenditure, and to seek approval of the transfer between the schools block and high needs block. So the first recommendation is around the early years block. So the first recommendation is noting an update on the early years funding, and that the authority will seek approval on the early years funding formula in January. So this starts on the bottom of page 14 of the report. You'll remember that government have announced the major childcare reforms through the expansion of the childcare arrangements, and the first tranche of those changes start in April 2024. It was announced in the summer of this year that some additional funding allocations have been made for the remainder of this financial year to support early years providers. That was a 1.5 million grant that's now being passed passported in full to providers. The local authority waiting further updates from the DfE on the estimates, and expect these in the later part of the autumn term. The consultation is currently, the early years consultation is currently open. Closes on the 1st of December. So for those schools where that's relevant, would encourage responses to that. That's covering the issues that will come back to Forum, so around the centrally retained funding, the inclusion fund, etc. And then so the consultation responses will come back to Forum, as well as the proposed funding allocations and the funding formula in January. So is there any questions on that recommendation? Okay. So moving on to the schools and high needs block. So the first recommendation is noting and considering the responses received to the school funding consultation document. So these are summarised through sections 3.2 and 3.5, and we'll sort of pick those up with each of the relevant consultation responses. We received 14 responses to the consultation, so a relatively small number of responses, but thank you to those schools that did respond. 8 from maintained primary schools, 8 from maintained secondary schools, 1 from a special and 1 from an academy trust. And then the responses to the questions vary from between 10 and 14 schools, depending on the response rates for each question. But as I say, we'll pick up the responses in each of the recommendations. So recommendation 2 is to consider the proposed funding formula factors to be used in 24-25. So this starts on page 15 of the report. The government published their proposals for school funding in 24-25 in July, but colleagues might have seen that these were then republished in October after a funding error. So the government said that they didn't, the overall envelope didn't change, but they accidentally over-allocated £370 million to schools, which meant that they then published a set of revised proposals in October. So to help colleagues understand the impact of that, so the original proposals had a 2.4% increase in the core factors, and the revised proposals, that was revised down to a 1.4% increase in the core factors, which equates to something in the region of £50 for an average primary school pupil, £60 for an average secondary school pupil, £20,000 for a 2 FE primary, £50,000 for a 6 FE secondary. So you understand the kind of the change that was. So so that's the figures in this report are now based on the revised figures. Stefan, did you want to come in on that?
Many of us wouldn't call it an error. My question is does the local authority have advance notice or concern regarding schools needing to make redundancies?
So in the autumn term, we've requested returns from schools around their 3-year plans and in-year budget monitoring. And so that indicates where schools are anticipating financial pressures. We're in dialogue with a small number of schools who are working towards deficit recovery plans, but there were broader conversations about school sustainability that will be picked up, and schools will be planning already for next year's budget, but in a more kind of concerted way through the spring term. So we're not immediately aware of redundancies in respect of this specific funding error and the implications of the funding error, but more broadly, school budgets are under pressure, and there are groups of schools who are using their surplus to balance their budgets moving into the next academic year, financial year, sorry. Falling roles school funding is largely based for mainstream, largely based on people-led factors, and so changes in demand will affect school budgets, and so those schools who are most impacted by changes in demand are also planning for the financial implications of that, and we're working with those schools who are most affected. Thanks.
Thanks, Tara. Okay, so moving through this section, so table 1 sets out the estimated schools block funding, and then the provisional pupil numbers used to estimate that funding are set out in at school level in Appendix 1. So primary numbers in October 23 were actually similar to the previous year. So it's a minor reduction across all schools. We were actually expecting that reduction to be slightly more than it has ended up being for this October. And then secondary numbers that continue to increase as those larger primary school cohorts move through into secondary. So overall, table 2 sets out those pupil number comparisons. But overall, it's sort of a minor change between the total pupil numbers for 2022 and 23-24 in terms of the impact they'll have on the areas that are pupil number driven, although there are larger changes for individual schools. Since 2018-19, Forum have agreed to adopt the structure of the NFF, and the proposal is to continue to do that where possible. So in line with those national changes in the national funding formula, where should it be necessary for affordability, it's proposed to scale back following the same principle as the last 2 years, scale back the low prior attainment and the deprivation factors, so the FSM6 and the IDARCI income deprivation indices, proportionately for primary and high school pupils. We're in a position as a local authority who are considered to be mirroring the national funding formula, where those adjustments, there's a limit on those adjustments that we can make to any particular factor. So that limit is now plus or minus 2.5%. So any individual adjustment, that would be the maximum adjustment that we could make to an individual factor. Early modelling indicates that it will be likely to scale those factors back, as we did in 23-24 for affordability, but that will hopefully be sufficient to then fund the other factors at the national funding formula. But we will do the work on that in December and report back to Forum in January on that once we have the finalised factors and allocations. So a couple of other things to mention in this area. So Forum members will remember that for the last 2 years, there's been additional funding announced in the autumn statement for schools and for high needs. So, and that's been passed through to schools as a supplementary grant 2 years ago and the mainstream schools additional grant last year. At the time of writing the report, the autumn statement hadn't happened, but it has now happened, and you'll have seen that there wasn't any additional funding for schools in the autumn statement this year. So there won't be an additional grants this year in the way that there has been for the past 2 years. Okay, so the recommendation around this is to consider and comment on the funding factors in the proposed approach. So are there any comments on this?
Hi. Can you just the appendix 2 comments around scaling back? It's probably, I just maybe don't understand it well enough in order to note it or vote on it. It sounds like the factors that make schools the most vulnerable are where we're going to be scaling back percentage increases. Is that what we're saying? That our most vulnerable schools are the ones we should be taking percentage increases from?
So because those factors were adjusted last year, the percentage increase, even if we then scaled those back to minus 2.5%, would still be the same kind of percentage increase that the other factors are seeing, if you see what I mean, because it's a continuation of the approach from the previous year. So you're still going to see the same level of percentage increase in those, even if those are then scaled back to the maximum 2.5%.
So we're scaling back there for affordability. That means there's somewhere else that's gaining or becoming neutral as a result. I just want to understand that in a better way, because it just sounds, I mean, I'm sure it makes sense. It just sounds not good. It doesn't sound right.
Yeah. So the affordability challenges with the funding formula come because there is a average per pupil element that's calculated by the DfE, but there's a kind of a lagged aspect of that. So where you have the total numbers of free school meals eligible children growing over time, that's not factored into the average funding level. So there's always a catch up between the average pupil funding rate that calculates our total DSG to allocate out to you guys, and the number of children who are eligible for those factors. So you end up having to scale back elements of the grant to remain within the total that's available. And so when you apply that through the funding mechanisms, those schools that have really low levels of deprivation, they end up at the minimum funding guarantee. And so if you scale back the main ARPU rate and don't scale back the other factors, you end up not reducing the overall level of spend. And so those elements that are driven through deprivation, etc., are the ones that make the biggest impact on the total funding that goes out. So through the modelling, it's quite difficult to explain it, but when you try to model it through, if there is a particular primary school in Ealing who is not eligible for very much deprivation funding at all, and if we scaled back the ARPU, their funding would drop below the minimum funding guarantee, and then we'd have to top them up to the minimum funding guarantee, which means we haven't reduced the overall amounts we're trying to allocate out. So we'd still have to come back to the deprivation factors. Yeah. Does that kind of make sense?
And I mean, as Tamara says, that's one of the reasons there's an affordability gap. The other reasons are some of the decisions we're discussing today around the growth fund, the minimum funding guarantee, the high needs block transfer. So the reasons for that there's an affordability gap are twofold. They're around those decisions, and they're around, as Tamara says, the lag between when the funding that we receive is based on and the funding that we allocate out to schools is based on.
I've just got a follow-up question, if that's okay. Can you hear me okay? I know I asked this in the pre-meeting. I just want to be really clear. I think it's just around the wording in the document, page 16, which we're talking about. Completely understand everything you've just said, but it then says schools that gain may also be capped or scaled for affordability purposes. It's that word "also" that's still just concerning me a little bit. Is that suggesting it, because you've said it's a maximum 2.5, but is that suggesting that there will be something in addition to that? Just want to be completely clear on that.
Yeah, so that goes back to the point that Kim was mentioning. So the individual funding formula factors can only change by so much. The DfE is prescribed that 2.5% variation. So if there was a big affordability gap, and I think what we're setting out is we don't think that will be required, the additional capping and scaling. But if there was a large affordability gap and we adjusted the funding formula factor rates and there was still a gap, the only way of adjusting the overall funding that goes out is to cap and scale the gains that schools who are seeing the biggest increases in funding would receive. And so if that was the case, what happens is we bring that detail back to forum. So at the moment, what we're agreeing is the principles. So do we agree we should stick as close as we can to the NFF and the basis of the broader decisions that we're making? And then we're setting out if there was an affordability gap once the government publishes the funding they do it the week before Christmas. So that's why we can't tell you now. So we'll be modelling this on the 20th of December to try and get it into the forum report for you guys to see it. So we'll model that through. And if there's a gap, then we would be working out how to cap and scale in kind of the fairest approach, and then set that out for you guys to take a view on as well to contribute to that decision. But that's the last kind of port of call really for containing the overall budget. So we can only allocate what we receive in, and so capping and scaling is the last resort for containing the total budget within the grant allocation.
But it's not something we've had to do. The affordability gap has been able to be managed by capping those, they're taking those factors down. So it's not something we've had to do in the past, but as Tobias says, we won't know for sure until we have the information through in December. So it's a principal thing.
So it hasn't happened before, but the reason we put it in the report is that there's so little time between now and the January meeting that if there's something kind of more drastic that happens, say the government announced that they got the funding wrong again, and we had to remodel it, we'd have to set that out, and we're trying to operate within some predefined principles about what we do first. So we could do capping and scaling first and not do the rest, but capping and scaling has a much broader effect of destabilising the funding across schools, and it disproportionately affects some schools, particularly those schools that are again under the formula under the deprivation factors. So that is something that is the last resort of the adjustments that we'd make, but we'd set that out in the modelling for you in January if we felt that we needed to apply that, and then we could have a discussion around it.
Okay, and that would be that last resort would only apply, as I understand it from what you've just said before, because some schools would therefore not meet the minimum funding formula. Is that right?
Yeah, so we wouldn't be able, we'll have maxed out the individual formula factor adjustments that are allowable. There may be schools that will be protected through the minimum funding guarantee. And then once that's worked its way through, if there is a gap, the capping and scaling would be how you close that gap across schools.
Thank you. So hopefully just a theoretical point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a more kind of agreeing the principle because of the nature of the decision making and the timing around it. But the thing that actually has an impact is how we scale back the funding, the kind of the shortfall that we are already aware of because of the reasons that we've set out, and using those factors is where the adjustments are being made.
Could I just ask them, if we do get into a situation where capping, scaling, moving around figures is necessary, which maybe it won't be. Obviously, the complexity of this for the average member, you know, is quite complex. But the underlying principles, I think, are things that people here would feel quite comfortable speaking and voting about. And I think that's where, you know, when I'm reading and I'm thinking this is in a different language. Oh, this is talking about deprivation. I understand that. It sounds like we're taking from the poor schools and giving to schools that, you know, that you don't understand what I'm saying. So if we get to a situation where decisions are needed to be taken around how that money is managed, maybe what would be helpful at that stage is that those options are made clear in some way that forum can say, well, I agree with the principle of where money is coming from here, because I think what you're saying, I agree with. We don't want to be taking from schools that have high levels of deprivation, already. But maybe not every member here agrees with that. Maybe they do think, well, actually those schools, they get a lot of extra money for pupil premium and this, and they could do to scale back. And, there may be members that feel that way. I'm not one of them, but I just think maybe understanding where those funding decisions, what the underlying principles of those or implications are, might be helpful in order to take, if we get to that stage. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can.
Thanks. Thanks, Ian.
I had a rather sort of general question rather than the pluses and minuses that we've been discussing. If we were to look at an overall position for schools looking year on year, because a lot of this comes down to affordability generally, year on year, what sort of percentage increase in funding has there been within, say, primary and secondary? Something I'm not particularly close to. I'm sure that many round the table are probably right on top of that, or perhaps this is a bit off topic, but it feels like one of the things that indicates how much pressure people are going to be under going forward.
So it's been higher because of these supplementary grants and additional amounts of money that have been agreed in the autumn statement for the last 2 years. So the increase in the funding formula factors this year, so the core factors, the increase is 1.4%. The average overall increase, when you're taking into account all the premises factors and then the other things, is 1.9%. And so you're talking about just under a 2% increase overall. It's going to be different for individual schools because the minimum funding guarantee would protect the per pupil funding increase at zero. Some schools will see a larger increase because of changes in pupil factors, etc. But that's kind of the average rate. For the last few years, the funding formula factors have increased, I think, by 2.4%, and then there's been an additional in the region of 3.4% through the supplementary grant. So it has been a larger increase that schools have seen over the last 2 years. Obviously, there's been a significant amount of pressure through pay grants and inflation.
But that's where I was going with it, Kim. You're exactly right, that at a time when schools are under more financial pressure than ever before, this is an odd time. But why are we surprised that funding should appear to be going up more slowly than it has done, at least in the last 2 years? And it's way below where it would need to be just to match inflationary pressures. So it's I know we can't fix it, but I'm just frustrated, as everyone else is, I'm sure. Yeah.
I mean, the other things and the other thing that schools will have for next financial year that they've also had for September to March of this financial year is the teacher pay grant, which is the additional funding that the government allocated for the amount over 3%, 3.5%. Where do we get to in the end? That was for the teacher pay grant. So that funding continues through into next financial year. But yes,
it's a continuing tightening, isn't it? That's what we're seeing. Yeah, thank you.
And I think actually Ian maybe has made a point that's helped me think about what I'm saying in a different way, just in terms of clarity, that I think the averages actually are the thing that I'm challenging, because there are 80-ish primary schools in Ealing, and if we talk about the averages, well, great, but actually disadvantaged or underserved communities make up a minority of schools, not a majority. And so if we talk about averages, that's where schools like that, I think, can get lost. And in terms of the underlying principles, what I would be interested in knowing is that if we're saying, well, we need to cap scale schools that are gainers, which are often high deprivation factors, in order to take, like, so we're saying the the 10 most deprived or disadvantaged schools are going to lose 0.5% to give 0.5% to the 10 most affluent IDACI schools, because they're below a 0% increase. I think I can probably digest that. If what we're saying is, well, schools that are underserved are getting a 2.8% increase, and schools that are in that top 10 group, well, they're getting a 0.2% increase. And so we need to cap and scale to make those gains a little bit more equal. Why I wouldn't be okay with that. And so I guess that's where I just want to understand those underlying principles, because I think in averages and these sorts of things, sometimes vulnerable schools, people can get lost.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to get into the realms of needing to cap and scale. And if we did, we would bring the modelling before and after and the options of how you might go about doing that. And forum members will have a view about, the least worst option essentially. And so that would come to forum in advance.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. Mic wasn't on, I think.
I was just saying we have full trust in officers, and this isn't a questioning of their excellent and wonderful expertise, just trying to understand more deeply.
Agree with you totally.
Want to continue, Kim, with the question?
Sorry. Recommendation 3 we've covered alongside recommendation 2, so noting that the where it should be necessary to adjust the formula factors. The 4th recommendation under the schools and high needs block is to agree the value of the minimum funding guarantee. So the proposal is to set that at 0%. The government set a range within which we can set the minimum funding guarantee each year, and for this year, as it was last year, the range is set between 0 and 0.5%. So the recommendation that we're putting to forum is to continue with the principle that we've used in recent years, which is to set that minimum funding guarantee at the minimum permitted, which would be 0% this year. Noting that MFG above that figure would reduce the maximum gains and move schools already above the NFF further away from it. There are 14 responses to the consultation on this, and 13 supported this, and 1 was unsure. The comments were around agreeing with the principle of keeping the formula as close to the national funding formula as possible, and that this has been a consistent approach in recent years. Based on the early estimations, it's a relatively small amount of money now that's impacted from the minimum funding guarantee. So provisionally, it would apply to a single school and be £11,000 on a 0%. And if it was 0.5%, that would increase. That would still just apply to the single school, and it would increase to £21,000. So it's relatively small amounts of money now. Some authorities have much larger numbers of schools who are protected by the minimum funding guarantee, but the increases that we've seen to funding in recent years and the principle of keeping as close to the national funding formula as possible has reduced that now. So it is just likely to be the 1 school that are impacted by that. But yeah, so that's the proposal that we need for members to vote on, is to keep that minimum funding guarantee and set it at the 0%.
So do we want to agree these as we go along? Yeah. So has anybody got any comments on that 4th proposal to agree the minimum funding guarantee at 0%?
No, I support it. Consistent.
Okay, so that's agreed. Thanks. Moving on to number 5, Kim.
Thanks. Recommendation 5 is to agree the transfer of the 0.5% from the schools block to the high needs block. So the approximate amount of that would be around 1.55 million this year, and to contribute towards spending pressures set out in the report and reported at previous meetings of the forum. So this is section 18, page 18 and 19 of the reports. So the high needs block allocation this year, the government have now published those allocations, and the increase that Ealing will see this year is a 2% increase in the high needs block. So Ealing have funded it the floor based on the national funding formula for the high needs block. and that funding floor has been reduced this year, and then it applies on a per pupil basis to certain elements of the high needs block. So it works out as a 2% increase to 79.5 million. That there previously has been, again, as I said, additional allocations agreed for the last 2 years at the autumn statement. So there hasn't been any additional funding for high needs either in the autumn statement this year. So that is the increase we'll see in the high needs block. And then the report sets out some of the funding pressures and also the pressures that we're seeing in terms of the increases in demand. So in between 22 and 23, there's a further 10% increase in the number of plans in Ealing, a 13% increase in the number of assessments. That's continued to increase through this calendar year. So the total number of plans is now up to 3,670 something. So yeah, that pressure from the demand, increase in complexity and numbers continues to increase at a pace that outstrips the increases in the high needs block.
Just got a question about this. So in normal years, we've agreed this 0.5% increase, but obviously this year we're just talking about you might need to scale back the EDACI and the other formulas in cases of affordability, and you're not going to find out about that till 20th of December when you start crunching the numbers. I'm just wondering whether in the January schools forum, is that too late to reverse this decision? Because what I'm thinking is we could agree that this 0.5%, today, but then actually in January, you could come back to us and say, we're having to scale back EDACI, low prior attainment, blah, 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 for affordability, because we've got a 1.5 million funding shortfall. And actually, we might agree as a schools forum to go, instead of giving that to our high needs block, we could keep that so we don't have to scale back for those things. Is that something that we're allowed to do as a schools forum, should the need arise?
Decisions need to be made either at this meeting or in January. So decisions can definitely come back to the January meeting. If we go beyond that, we'd need to have an exceptional meeting because we need to submit our budget to the DfE, and it needs to be politically ratified as well. So some of the decisions around the funding formula factors, schools forum are consultees rather than decision makers, and it's actually the council that makes the decision. So the decision on the minimum funding guarantee 0% is a school forum decision. The decision on the 0.5% is a school forum decision. The decision around the structure of the funding formula is a council decision, but it's heavily informed by consultation with schools. I think one of the challenges is ultimately, so Kim mentioned in the previous discussion that the approach to adjusting some of the funding formula elements has been an approach that has been in place for a number of years. And so the approach that we're proposing is a continuation of that. And so the gap in affordability is in relation to a handful of things which we've already discussed. And so the action of continuing that still means that schools will receive, is it 1.4%? Yeah, 1.4% increase on those funding formula factors, but they're starting at a slightly adjusted rate. And so those rates and the difference between the national funding rates and the current proposed rates on the basis of these agreements potentially proceeding are set out in the appendix. So you can see exactly what the adjustments are. The decision around the 0.5%, and I think it goes back to some of the principles. So in the past schools forum and the consultation, and I think this time round also is leaning towards agreeing the 0.5% transfer.
Yeah, so the consultation, 69% of schools supported the transfer, and 3 schools, so 23%, did not support it. So there were some strong views against supporting it, but the majority of schools supported continuing the transfer.
Yeah. And so if forum were minded to bring the 0.5% back to January, that's absolutely something that could happen. I think ultimately the context of the decision is going to largely remain unchanged. So the capping and scaling is unlikely to happen, but absolutely if there was some material change that required capping and scaling, revisiting that decision is something that can happen. I think the principle around setting the funding formula rates is set out in the document, and that's not likely to change significantly. And so the decision on agreeing the 0.5% is in line with what we're already setting out to you as the proposed structure of the formula. So I guess it's what would Forum like to see happen between now and January that would be different from making the decision now?
I think from my understanding, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that you don't think you're going to have to scale anything back, but you're not sure until you get the figures on the 20th of December.
So I think I want to be really clear, and but I don't want to misunderstand the question, misinterpret the question. So there are adjustments to the funding formula factors, and that's set out in the appendix. So there are some adjustments to deprivation factors that are already being proposed.
Yes.
The capping and scaling is on top of that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're not going to know. It's unlikely to happen, but absolutely, if that does happen and it's material and school forum want to revisit it, we can bring the decision back.
So my question was, if the current rates are as in the appendices and they don't change, I would be minded to agree the 0.5%. If there's a big affordability issue and it's likely you'd have to cap and scale beyond that, actually, I'd rather that 0.5% stays in the main schools block and stops people being made redundant rather than goes to the high needs block, personally. So I was just wondering whether we have the mechanism to maybe today say we agree it subject to there being no further scaling and capping. But if there is further scaling and capping, we bring it back to January.
Yeah, that's absolutely possible from a decision-making perspective.
Ian, did you want to?
Well, I was just trying to get my head around the likelihood, the point that's just been made about it's not at all certain whether the scaling and capping is going to happen. But my understanding, Tamara, is that one of the biggest challenges we have at the moment is special needs across, both within special schools and within mainstream. And it feels as though that problem is going to be there for sure, 100% going forward. And therefore, doing anything less than the most we are allowed to do, which is the 0.5, would feel to be putting pressures on mainstream schools addressing their SEN requirements. But I might have interpreted that, but that was my take on it. What's your feeling?
Dima?
I think there's an argument from some mainstream school heads that 0.5% is from the mainstream block and should be spent on all children in schools, not just those children with SEND. And if we're struggling to meet the basic needs as a functioning school, actually, there's an argument from some head teachers that 0.5% shouldn't be given to SEND if it needs to actually be used in the first instance just to keep a school functioning at its minimum levels, which might be the case if we were having to do further capping and scaling.
Sure.
I mean, I suppose, the point that Jimmy makes opens a wider point, which could potentially open up a further consultation period, which is then we would have to look at all of the delegation in the round. If that's the case, if there's capping and scaling issues potential, not only do we look at the high needs budget, the high needs 0.5, but do we de-delegate services? Do we award money to the central services block? So it's actually, I'd imagine, it would require, we've already went through a consultation. I may be wrong in this, but it actually opens up a broader question about all of the top slicing and whether that should happen at all. So I suppose the challenge is we've been through a consultation period, which is essentially having given feedback. It would need to have potentially have come up in the consultation. Tamara,
Yeah.
just before you.
Sorry.
Or do you want to?
Just to say, those of us online can't hear anything.
Sorry, just we need to give the officers a steer, and the proposal made here was we, in principle, agree the 0.5. And it's only thrown up in the air if things are desperate when we get to January. That gives something, you need something to go forward on, and we can't leave you suspended in midair. So I would echo your proposal that we in principle agree the 0.5, but come back if there's anything desperate in January.
Did you want to follow up? Tomorrow?
Thanks. Thank you, Paul. So I think if forum members are minded to agree in principle to the 0.5% transfer and to revisit the decision should capping and scaling be required due to affordability, then that's absolutely something that we can work towards, and it's unlikely that will happen, but it gives you the opportunity to revisit the decision in January if there is a material shift.
John?
Hi, Tamara. Could you just tell us a little bit about how the plans are going forward with this? So we ended up last year with a £570,000 deficit brought forward into this financial year. It's looking like it's going to be around about 4 million by the end of the year, and there could be some application of reserves, but that's unlikely to cover too much of that. So there could be a considerable deficit at the end of the year. What's the plan? Is it that we will continue to grow that deficit in a managed way because it's impossible to do otherwise? And if so, what's the threat that comes with that? What are the measures which might be taken, and what do we need to pay attention to?
Thanks, John. So the report sets out the current in-year pressure, so the forecast, and you can see that demand is continuing to increase at a pace that outstrips the percentage increase. Inflation outstrips the percentage increase, let alone the demand and the broader complexity of need that you're all experiencing in your schools. So we are expecting the cumulative deficit to grow by the end of the year. We're expecting that it should come down below the £4 million once you apply the reserves that have been agreed in the July forum, but also if there are any reserves that remain at the end of this financial year in respect of early years contingency and other small budgets that come back to forum for a decision, that would offset that amount as well. Moving into the next financial year, demand between 22 and 23 went up by 10%, and we are expecting demand to continue at a pace. The SEND strategy is working towards managing demand where possible, early intervention, support to schools. And as part of that, the local offer and the sufficiency of specialist provision is part of that plan. And so we're expecting there to continue to be significant pressures in the high needs block and on the budget. But there are activities that we're hoping will kind of taper that kind of increase in pressure. It's quite challenging to know where we'll end up by the end of next year, but we're unlikely to balance the budget. And so some of the decisions, and the decision around the 0.5%, I think it's helpful to have a provisional decision and a steer at this stage. But forum members will be aware, some maybe more than others, that we have reviewed the funding mechanism for special schools. We're looking at additional resource provision, and we want to move into a space where we can look at mainstream top-ups, because there are pressures around mainstream top-ups and funding levels as well. And I think the context of needing to make those decisions and potentially adjust funding levels, and so that's, those reviews have resulted in increases. It will be quite challenging for us to take forward that work in the context of chunks of potential budget being removed. And so there could be a knock-on effect of how we prioritise the grant that's available to us as we moved into the next financial year and beyond. And so it's just to understand that there are kind of broader implications of decisions around the 0.5% than just the 0.5% decision. So hopefully that gives a little bit of context. We do update on the high needs block throughout the year. And there will be, we usually plan to do an update for the April meeting of forum, where we set out kind of the provisional and outturn pressures, etc., and we can give an update on the deficit recovery plan associated with the deficit that emerges at that point and SEND strategy.
So I think there's two options here, which I suspect we're going to have to take a vote on. for the voting members. So I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, unless there's any more comments or questions. So the two options are to agree in principle the 0.5 transfer to the high needs block, and then to review it in the January meeting, or to agree the 0.5 transfer as it's proposed here. So the only way I can think to move this on is to have some sort of vote on that. Or has anybody got any other ideas? Sorry.
Sorry, just on the basis of the first option, the option to review is on the basis of a shift in the requirement to cap or scale. So not, you know, because to make that decision wouldn't be to make a decision at all if it's a completely open-ended. So the basis for it coming back would be if there were a proposal to cap or scale, then we would revisit the 0.5% transfer decision that potentially would be made today. No, it didn't adjust your suggestion. It just clarified the basis for revisiting the decision.
Okay.
That's all.
So on the basis of what Tamara said, who wants to vote for the in-principle decision to agree and then potentially change our minds in January? 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is Iman a voting member? Yeah. Oh, sorry, is it? Sorry?
All schools.
Including governors?
Yeah. All four members.
All 4 members. Okay, so was that 7? So the first proposal is to agree in principle with the caveat on the basis of capping and scaling in the January form, and to potentially reverse a decision if there's a significant issue around capping and scaling. Or so that's number 1. Yeah. It's more of an in principle decision. Number 2 is to agree the 0.5 transfer now.
Right. Because we're talking about 8.4. Right? Sorry.
24,
We're talking about
Sorry.
Sorry. We're talking about a 0.5% transfer for April 2024. So like in 6 months. Yeah. Right. So we're not in a situation where we can start making changes like this in 6 months. This is a very big beast. Not turning over this 0.5% is not really an option, is it? If we want to have this conversation about a 0.5% denial or decline, I think we probably need to be talking about April 25 as a strategy. I think April, like 6 months from now, is really, really soon. And lots of decisions and things have been, you know, based on this. I think, yes, we have voting rights, but this is really an in principle, this is a notional decision. If we want to approach it with a different strategy, I'm not saying I'm for or against it. I'm just saying this is not the time to say in 6 months, we're going to change the entire strategy.
I think that was the point that I was trying to raise about the consultation. Is it, you know, as a forum member standing aside from my chair, is that there has been a consultation period, and that was the purpose of the consultation, was to garner views on this. And I completely get what they propose, completely get it. And there are different views on it, but I suppose it would need to come up in the next consultation period. I mean, clearly we have as forum, we either agree it or we don't agree it. But I think to be mindful of the fact there has been a consultation period about this very issue. So, so let me do that again. Or not? Does it seem a fair way to proceed, or is it a bit?
No, I think you're right, Paul. I think maybe then what I'm suggesting, and maybe off the back of what Jamie is talking about, because I don't necessarily disagree in principle with what you're saying and what some of the comments that have come through the consultation. that maybe there needs to be some time built in at some stage to have a conversation about the strategy moving forward. Because the thing that I'm thinking then that I come back to every year in the last 4 or 5 years I've been on forum is I'm happy in principle for money to be transferred. I think that we need to be doing that. I'm not necessarily, I don't necessarily believe that our strategy to reduce the amount we spend on send over like that overarching strategy that we were talking about is necessarily the right one. And so I think that there is a conversation we need about, well, if we're going to keep handing money over every year, great. Like, I think we need to be doing this, but is the strategy that we have right now around increasing ARPs and managing and training and early intervention, is that the right strategy? And, you know, we probably need some time in a meeting to talk about what was the consultation on that, what involvement of schools had in that strategy. I'm sure that there's lots of things, but I just think that maybe needs to be made clear so that when we have a conversation about, is this not 0.5% a strategy we want to continue with, that there's real clarity around the direction of travel and why.
Yeah, I sorry, I haven't put my hand up. I would agree that even if the plans that are being worked on to improve the situation do start to deliver, the chances are, as Jeremy's just said, are unlikely to deliver in the time frame that we're looking at, and to take away an existing funding stream for something that's already one of the greatest pressure areas for schools in Ealing looks like tricky to implement. We all accept we should be able to fund both things, but we can't, arguably, and I'm afraid I tend to go with sticking with the 0.5.
Can I just come in there? I've got my hand up. Just to say, I think we're perhaps getting ahead of ourselves, because this was just a principle. You know, this is my understanding was the vote was just to consider it. And I mean, the reason I voted for option 1 when it appeared to be a vote, but I'm not sure if it is anymore, was because, you know, I just think in this very unlikely event that we would be looking at this capping, that it would just be good for us to be in a position to look at what the implications would be. And it doesn't mean we're going to then necessarily make a decision around the high needs funding, does it? But the principle is just around whether it's going to be considered in January, as I understand it.
I think there is a substantial difference. And the substantial difference is that I think it's no mean feat for officers to manage this very complex situation on a quick turnaround, because, you know, the in principle decision, one of the outcomes could be that we retract the decision, which would throw everything that is structured around this sort of up into the air. So it is, you know, it is quite even though it's an in principle decision, I think it's got real implications for forum. So I think we're in a little bit of a sort of dilemma at the moment. Marion.
Well, perhaps as chair, you need to make the decision if we're not to put it to a vote.
I think I'd like to resign at this Marion?
Is there then a third option,
I think
which
the third,
is about agreeing, and if by the next meeting we're then finding that decision was problematic, that we undertake to develop the longer term strategy, because this is a political issue about the pressures on send. It just isn't just Ealing, is it? It's a bigger picture. And so is it about that we agree it, and then if we end up in a situation where you're thinking, well, I regret that decision, and I would like to retract, but obviously we won't retract because of all the reasons that you said about the consultation, but that we will undertake a longer term conversation with full consultation about a different approach. Was that more complicated?
I mean, from my point of view, that's the approach I would take, is that you know, it's, for want of a better way of expressing this, it's too late in the day for this this particular event, you know, time of the year, but that we should then really decide how we're going to move forward in this at the next consultation period. And people really, you know, we have a strong response. I mean, you know, this was put to schools, this was put to 68 or 80 schools, and there were 14 responses on this, and, you know, from active members of the forum. So there was a consultation period, and notwithstanding, and I completely get it, notwithstanding that all of the very genuine concerns around this, it almost would be, I would prefer forum to stick with to agree in it or not agree in it. And then really keeping it on the agenda for the next round of consultation. But if there's a view that's different from forum, then.
Yeah, I think you said, Kim, that 2/3 of those who responded said they were in support of it, or am I mixing it up with a different proposal?
Sorry.
69%, so just over 2/3.
I know, but that's to do with the consultation responses. There were 60, you know, there were 80 schools in this authority, and they were asked over and over again to respond to this consultation. You know, Charlotte?
Thank you. I was just going to say that I think the thing that's changed in this, I think the 0.5 is the thing we consulted on, and I think we had a good understanding of that to a degree. But I think the thing that's changed in this conversation is perhaps a growing understanding of what capping and scaling might look like. And therefore, that's where the confidence step back has happened. I think if we are able to stick with the principles that we consulted on around the 0.5, but with a recognition that we will be able to spend some time or have some more information to help us to understand what capping and scaling might look like, or does look like, if we have to use it. Because we're spending a lot of time on something that we think is not going to happen, realistically. But it's enough to have unsettled our confidence for some people. And therefore, knowing that we can understand more of that moving forward, I think would be good. I think the 0.5 can be a separate thing, as was consulted on. But we have gained, or I certainly gained, a growing understanding in this meeting of what that might look like if we're capping and scaling. And therefore, a commitment to explore further would be great. And I really like your idea also. We are in a very significant national local situation around SEND, and that's going to be exponentially continuing. And I think being involved in a response to that it would be a really exciting opportunity as well. That was my most positive words, with the exciting opportunity.
Thanks, Charlotte. So what I'm going to do is ask who agrees with the 0.5 transfer to. One, two, three, four, five, six, 7, 8, 9. Who doesn't agree? 1. Okay, so we'll agree at this time, and then we'll have some work to do on capping and scaling and the implications of capping and scaling. Okay, thank you for your contributions.
Okay.
Recommendations.
So moving on to recommendation, can't remember Roman numeral 6. So recommendation 6 is around agreeing the basis for allocating funding from the growth fund, as set out in the report, and about whether or not we proceed with the falling roll fund. It's kind of 2 recommendations. So picking up the growth fund area first. So colleagues remember, so the growth fund's included within the schools block and funded through a formula that's allocated from the DfE to the local authority. That funding has reduced as they've moved towards the formulaic approach, and we're envisaging that funding to be that we get in the schools block for growth fund to be slightly lower than last year based on provisional figures, so just under, what's that, 140,000 lower than it was last year. The growth fund allocation is intended to fund 2 things. So it's explicit growth, which is expansions of existing schools and bulge classes. So things that would to fund additional classes that would not otherwise be funded because of the lag nature of the school funding formula. And then the implicit growth is new schools that are growing through that needs to be funded as those year groups are added on. So the only school that's still continuing to grow through currently is Arc's Own. And so that's the commitment around the implicit growth fund. The proposal is to continue with the existing rules, which is, and they're set out on pages 21 and 21. So it's around funding the additional places at the ORPU rate for primary and high schools. And those rates are set out at the bottom of page 20. They're slightly different than the rates that were in the consultation document, because the consultation document rates were based on the government's original figures, which were then slightly reduced. But they're in line with the ORPU factors. And then there are two other areas where we fund around building works in exceptional cases, which are £15,000 one-off fundings in those situations. There never previously was an actual requirement for local authorities to fund those growth fund classes. There's now an explicit requirement for local authorities to fund those, where we're agreeing bulge classes. I think the majority of local authorities would, because they wouldn't have got them agreed otherwise, but that's now an implicit an explicit requirement to fund those. Our current rules around that are slightly higher than the rate that we would have to fund through there, but we feel that scaling back those allocations would be really problematic for us, both in terms of agreeing the bulge classes with the small number of schools where that is actually a possibility, and so the proposal is to continue with the current rules around the growth funds. There is it does create a pressure on the schools block, because the estimate for the growth fund spend for 24-25 is higher than the allocation would be when you take into account implicit growth. So it is a small pressure on the schools block, but we feel that it is necessary in terms of enabling us to manage the requirement for agreeing bulge classes with schools.
Anybody want to comment on item 6? We okay to agree that?
Existing rules. The falling role funding. So local authorities are allowed to also set aside schools block funding to create a falling role fund. In the past, that would always have to have been a top slice, so there wasn't any specific funding for falling roles. There is, for the first time, an allocation. Well, the government will allocate or are allocating falling role funding to local authorities, but they're only allocating it in cases where there's been a 10% or more reduction in a single year across a super output area, so a small area covering around 1 to 5 schools across the borough. Ealing haven't seen any 10% reduction. So in some previous years, we have seen that level of reductions at an area level. This year, we haven't seen any reduction of that level. So we don't receive any funding through the allocation for it. So if colleagues were minded to agree a falling role fund, that would need to be an additional top slice. That'd be the only way to fund that. The responses to the consultation, 11 schools agreed with the local authority proposal not to introduce a falling role fund, and the comments in support of not introducing it agreed with the assumptions in the consultation document that large scale falls followed by medium toe rises seemed unlikely, because the only if you have a falling role fund, we can only then allocate it in cases where we're forecasting that roles are going to increase again in the 3 to 5 year period. So it's quite stringent conditions of when you can actually allocate that funding. And the other comments in support were around advocating that schools should be monitoring their pupil numbers and planning to adjust staffing and spend in advance where falling roles are forecast, and that having a falling role fund may sort of prevent that action being taken at an early enough stage. So yes, that's a vote on whether any comments, and a vote on whether colleagues agree that we should continue to not have a falling role fund.
So we agreed, so that there were 2 parts, that item 6 around growth fund, and then not to agree the falling role fund. Does anybody any comments about not agreeing the falling role fund? Okay, do we want to agree that? Item 6, yeah. Okay, item 7.
Okay, so recommendation 7 is me to agree the education functions on a line by line basis. So this is something for maintained school members to vote on because it's something that only impacts on maintained school members. So this is set out on page 22 of the report, or starting on page 22 of the report. And table 5, which is at the bottom of table 22, and top of table 20, page 23, sets out the current rates and budgets and the proposed rates and budgets. So the proposal is to increase the education function lines by 5% to broadly meet the cost of the government staff pay award for the most recently agreed government staff pay award, on the principle that they're largely funding existing staffing arrangements. The responses to the consultation, so 7 of the 11 schools responding to this, so 64% supported funding the education functions so the total amount would be £36.69, an increase from £34.93 last year, and then the individual amounts for each area are set out in the table. So 7 schools supported that, and there were 3 not supporting that, with a range of reasons relating to different funding lines. So those are set out on page 23, with the kind of comments around those.
Jeremy?
Just for clarification, can I ask the average? No, I just said how much aid averages, but the average percentage increase to school budgets last year or this year is anticipated to be, and we're asking for how much to maintain these functions? What percentage?
So the increase on average is just under 2%, so the per pupil funding. And the proposed increase is a 5% increase to cover the staff, but the proposed increase that schools have had, you remember that also there have been the increases in terms of the teacher pay grant and other kind of areas of funding, as well as the increase that you'll see through the schools book.
Not that I'm suggesting again that we're making changes to this for April, but I think that we need a better understanding with those grants of the amount of money that schools are given to maintain their central services in building in situ versus the amount we're being asked for the local authority to maintain those same services. And my view is that if schools on average, including extra grants, are going up by 3% in a year and having to make redundancies and other cost saving mechanisms work to have the school function, that we probably need to question why we would be giving more money back to the central services than schools are getting themselves. And so I'm not saying right now that we make that change for April. I think things are in place and we need to have conversations about this, but I think it's slightly cheeky to be asking for maybe more on average than schools get.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I can understand entirely the point you're making. I think the challenge for the local authority is, as you know, as schools are facing financial pressures, so is the local authority, and so all services that maintain schools need to be funded, and the scale of the services that we have as local authority to support the number of schools that are maintained are relatively small. And so the impact and implication of shaving bits of post offices, it's not possible to do it in that way. And so it would require a much more radical change to approach of how we deliver those services potentially. And so it's absolutely a conversation we can have, but we do need to have a lead in time if that is the position of Forum. I think the proportionate impact for the local authority services, just because of the size of the budget, is proportionately small when compared with the overarching funding, if that makes sense. But I understand the principle you're making. I think the impact of that approach potentially has bigger kind of implications on the scale and of support that we're able to offer.
And I'm not,
Does that
I'm
make
not,
sense?
yeah, it does. And I'm not, as I said, I wouldn't be suggesting that we'd be talking about this for 6 months from now. But while I don't I don't intellectually disagree with you. I think what you're saying makes sense, but I think what you just said would be a really hard sell in a room full of head teachers, right? And that's who I'm here representing. And that's where I think, I don't disagree with you, but I think a lot more clarity is needed around how that would work or not work.
Chairman?
Bring maybe a solution to the table. Is there a way we could have a schools forum meeting like this when you publish the consultation so that we can really understand it, ask these kind of questions, then go back to the head teachers in our quadrants and say, this is what this means, this is why this is why that, so that the uptake for the consultation is raised and we're more clued in about what all of this stuff actually means. Because it seems like we're asking you these questions and getting to grips with it now, but that's after the consultation is finished and way too late for you to do any modelling on it. Is there a way we can move our meetings around or put an extra meeting in or something so that we're asking these questions as the consultation is out to fix a lot of these worries and concerns we've got?
I think that's eminently, I'm glad you brought that point up, because I was going to say about this, eminently sensible, honestly, really sensible, because one of the general gist of this meeting, if nothing else, is this consultation needs to be taken seriously by our colleague heads. And I completely understand why forum members and colleague heads get overwhelmed by the consultation, but we really need to take this consultation seriously as head teachers and find a way of presenting it, the pros and cons, in a readable English way, or whatever that means, simplified way, so that people really understand what's at stake here. Because what we're doing is we're being caught in debates after the consultation period, but going forward next year, we really need to take this consultation seriously, have, you know, a proper presentation on it, and unpick the things that we need to pick, and also see the benefits of what we're committing to and not committing to. So I, for one, second that.
And Jamie, just to respond to that, so we, at the time of the consultation, we put on information sessions where we can go through the proposals and answer schools' questions. And we had 3 of those sessions this year, 2 in person and 1 online. And we had 2 schools come along to those. So one school sent a number of people, including their governors, to that session. But yeah, we only had 2 schools take up that offer. So I think it's perhaps using one of those sessions.
But if we were to do it at Schools Forum, we're motivated to make the right decisions. That's why we're here on Schools Forum. So we would then be motivated to go back to our colleague head teachers, explain it properly, get them to give us their views. So we're invested in this, and it might be a better way to use us than put on 3 of those meetings and have 2 people come. You could actually put on 1 of these, have all of us come, and we would then cascade that back.
So I wonder if I can make a suggestion. So to have an additional meeting of the forum is a change to the terms of reference of forum, and actually the discussion and the debate and engagement sounds like the key thing that we're trying to achieve. Now this year, due to the timing of announcements, the consultation was drafted quite late on in the summer term, and we do share that with head teacher colleagues for comment before it's published. The previous year, we were able to have a meeting in the summer term to discuss the consultation, and some of this discussion happened at that conversation. And so I wonder whether actually, you know, the autumn is too late because we need to publish the consultation document, and changing tact at the last minute is going to be challenging. And so to have a discussion about the principles and the areas that forum would like us to further model, look at, etc., to have that discussion, not as a formal meeting of the forum, but a meeting of representatives of the forum, to have a discussion about the consultation document, probably in late June, early July time.
That's good.
Okay.
And I think there's probably just a layered approach that we might need with it, because I think you do put on the information sessions every year, and you know, I've been some years and not others, but the idea that I think, yeah, Jamie's spot on, that this group is an advocacy group as well as a representative group. And so it might be that there is that meeting, but then rather than adding meetings to the calendar for consultation, coming to quadrants or, mechanisms that already are established where people are already going to be, and that we block out time in the autumn for that to happen, so that it's, we've had that, we then are going to quadrant, you're coming along with us, we can support you in that meeting to help translate some of the stuff down to head teacher language. I just wonder if around strategy, that's maybe some of the things we're looking at.
So Kim and I are happy to attend existing meetings between heads, and also we sometimes use the head teacher briefings that are scheduled in autumn 1 as well. So happy to agree the schedule of events that you'd like us to attend.
I think this meeting is the better one, because we've been on these women's forum for years, and when you join the forum you don't understand what's going on for years because it's so complicated, and when you're in your second term you start going, oh, now I get it. So actually us groups sitting around together, like Jeremy will say something, I'll say something, we'll spark off each other and we'll go, oh, now I understand it a lot better now. So actually this group I think are really powerful in picking it apart and being able to understand it really well and then take that back to heads. If you go to quadrant and there's only one of us there, we lose that power. So I honestly think an unofficial meeting of forum is probably the best way to do that, and then we can then feed it back. That's my view, because there's strength in the knowledge that we've gained as the forum group.
Okay, so I think we were on. Sorry, Ian.
I was going to bring it back to the original question that was asked about whether or not increasing these particular things, because I agree that further, sorry, let me pick up the bit about consultation. Yes, better consultation would certainly be beneficial. I'll let you fight out how best to deliver that. But going back to these points, the point about whether increasing these, but I think you said by 5% when overall funding is going up by 3%. I think Tamara, you said that would, if we were to align it all at 3%, that would cause great difficulty to provide the services centrally. Is that true, or is there still a possibility? I think everyone would accept that you can't go up by 0 because that wouldn't work, but would 3% be unacceptable and then at least align with what schools are seeing more generally?
I think, sorry, Tamara, I mean, I know it's a question for Tamara. I think it sort of goes back to the previous point. I think it's something for the next discussion.
Right.
We've arrived at these list of recommendations and notes to be agreed. So it's been extremely valuable discussion and debate now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to move on with what we have presented to us tonight. Sorry, Tamara, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. So I think just something to note. So we've cheekily come back with a 5% request because that's the pay award. But in previous years, we haven't requested an increase in line with the pay award. So in real terms, this budget has reduced over time because the services have increased around, where it has increased, it's increased in line with agreements around the learning partnership and the school improvement functions, and specific things Forum have really worked very hard to understand and debate before coming to those decisions. And inflationary increases around pay award have been absorbed. And I think just the point I'm making about the implications of a decision is we can't shave off 2% of a person. The implication is a service will need to consider how it delivers its function and potentially makes quite a radical change to a specific service. And so that would need to be worked through, which is Forum's asking us to consider. So I think what we haven't set out in the report is what the increases have been over time. But actually, if you saw that, you'd see that in real terms, the budget for the same post has not increased in line. And we've tried to work to absorb those pressures within the funding available. And this year we are asking for the 5%, because like you guys, local authorities across the board are under massive financial pressure, and we're not going to be able to negotiate an approach which the council is subsidising school services, essentially.
Yeah, I think we have little choice, really.
So in terms of item 7? Are we okay to agree that? Yep, thank you. Moving on to item 8, agree delegation of certain services.
Yeah, so this is an area for maintained schools to vote on, but this time around, because delegation decisions are made separately by primary schools and high schools, it's a separate vote for primary members and for the high school members. So we've set out in table 6, which is on page 24, the proposed dedelegated services for 24-25, the rates and how they compare to the rates in 23-24. So the proposal for contingencies is to keep that at the same rate as in 23-24, and 73% of schools supported that in the consultation. For TU facility time, the proposal is to increase that in line with the teacher pay awards, so the 6.5% teacher pay awards. So it's a proposed increase in the rates from £4.29 to £4.57 for primary schools, and £3.02 to £3.22 for secondary schools. Forum members will remember the conversations we've had in previous years about the reasons for the differences between primary and high schools being based on previous decisions made by those sectors.
Which can be reversed to the side.
So at the January meeting of the forum, the representative staff nominated by recognised TUs raised the issue that the number of days paid for by the facility time for NEU trade union representatives reduced, while at a time where membership has been increasing. So overall, there's been a small surplus on the account for the TU facility time for the last few years, which has partly been related to claims from some trade unions being lower than they have been historically. So the proposal is to contain the level of increase in line with the pay award, and address the issue of redistribution of allocations at the annual allocation meeting, rather than do a larger increase than the pay award. Stefan?
For forums information, and I can state this very accurately because when the NASUWT did their disaggregate ballot, I was able to count every individual NASUWT member in every school in Ealing. So we are, and then using the DFE data in terms of number on roles, we have the number of classroom teachers, not including SLT, on the SLT payroll, is over 80%. If you include those who are on supply agencies working long term, it's going to be a lot more than that. My estimation, there was about 146 NASUWT members in total. The NEU has 3,400 members. A small percentage belong to the NHT Edge. Another smaller proportion belong to ASCL, and maybe 5 or 6% don't belong to any union. Virtually every classroom teacher and middle management is in the NEU in Ealing.
Thank you, Stefan. So the free school meal eligibility checking area. So the proposal there is to increase the funding in line with the pay awards, but that would be then the pay award for the staff that funds. So one of the comments that came back through the consultation was around that being not the same increase as the other areas, because it's a different pay award. The increase that's being proposed there is a 6% increase, because that's the average increase in the staffing that area funds. So the dedelegation of that area largely covers staffing costs, with some of it covering system costs. At the moment, that area is being propped up, as well as with funding from the Household Support Fund, which is because the team are also working on the vouchers and the school holidays. So that may need, if that does end, that may need to come back for a further decision around maintaining the current service. But at the moment, that's a proposal for the increase for the pay award for 24-25. And then the final area dedelegated is the primary behaviour support services. So the increase to, again, that the proposal there is an increase to cover staff pay awards. So 55% of schools agreed with this proposal. And this is the services delivered through the Ealing Primary Centre outreach. So yeah, the proposal is to increase that by 6.5%, and so the rates are set out in table 6.
Okay, so we need to agree these line by line contingencies. Agreed. Trade union, primary. Agreed. Trade union, secondary. Agreed. Free school meals. Agreed. And behaviour support. No.
And at the, I want to say it was at the previous meeting, but now I'm confusing meetings maybe, but at some stage I had asked about, because obviously it says, you know, the provisional budget, 225,000. I would love to think that John runs a service on 200 grand, but I know that that's not the case. So obviously there's central money that comes into this service, and then there's money now that we're being asked to give. Can we just clarify only for the outreach? That's what I want to clarify.
And it does say that in the.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's specifically for outreach, and it funds 2 teachers and a mental health professional in there.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think we need more money. I think it's not enough money. And I'm wondering now if this is the maximum, because those decisions, this is a decision I think in 6 months be willing to change. Are we, you know, like, we're in a, sorry?
I think we can bring it up in the next consultation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because the
But it is what
parameter,
it is now.
sorry?
It is what it is now.
Well, it's been set out methodically, and we've had our opportunity to feed back on this. Absolutely, couldn't agree more, you know, but Julie Lewis?
I think 2024 is certainly the year to think about this in the round, because we have a newly appointed head of access and inclusion, and his job is to review the sort of graduated response of services and support to schools around children with SEMH, presenting needs, behavioural needs, and the outreach service provided by the Ealing Primary Centre is one of those kind of functions, you know, within a broader suite of support. So I would suggest that we kind of come back to this within that broader overview of services that we're trying to develop to support schools in supporting children as part of that early intervention offer.
And it would be good, you know, for members like us to garner more views from our colleagues with regards to behaviour and behaviour support. Because it's a point well made, Jeremy, about is because SEMH is hitting us all over the shop. So.
Yes, wholeheartedly agree. I think so. Again, I mentioned this in a previous meeting. Behavior support services is somewhat misleading, and I think that behavior in itself creates this polarization. Social, emotional, mental health outreach is not something that is controversial. That's something post-COVID we're all going more, please, more, please, more, please. And I think that for future consultations and conversation, we need to make this really crystal clear about, because the work that's happening is incredible, but it's so limited by the fact that there are two people.
Yeah, the wording of behaviour support services is DFE wording for what you're allowed, the areas you're allowed to de-delegate, rather than our wording. But you're right, it needs to be framed in what it actually covers and supports.
Please excuse me, it's my daughter's 16th birthday. I promise to be back by 8.
I think one point that came up was that there isn't enough money, and that's really the root of nearly every discussion we have, and it applies in this area at least as much as anywhere else, doesn't
Absolutely.
it?
Thanks, Ian. Iram, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I just had a question. I mean, we are obviously agreeing everything up in like a predictive format, yeah? So we're saying this is what we predict. But if there was a general election, would the funding allocation likely to change, and how would that change how we are voting with regards to money? That was the question.
I suppose in the short term, there wouldn't be enough capacity to change, because the general election is probably going to be in a year's time. So in the short term, there won't be any. Who knows what the sort of medium to long term views of any new government would be? But I think it's an interesting point, Erin, about the predilection of any particular party being in government.
Yeah, but so at the moment they're single year funding agreements that the government publish. So they've published the funding agreement for 24-25. That isn't going to change, but the funding agreements for future years could well be influenced and impacted by any changes to national government.
So the good news from Kim is I have to go through this whole blooming process every year. Okay. So moving on to item 9.
Yeah, so item 9 is around the Central Schools Services block. So Ealing will see a 2.9% increase in the per pupil rate in that block. So because we're continuing to see a big increase in free school meal entitlement, we are actually continuing to see an increase in that block, because that's one of the key factors that drives the funding for that. So the provisional block values are set out in table 7, and then table 8 sets out the proposed allocations of that funding. So that could still change as the funding gets finalised, but any kind of change, if there's a more funding than is currently set out in that table, we'd bring that back to January for a decision for forum. So at the moment, there's an anticipated £59,000 increase, and 34,000 of that's been assigned against the copyright licence line, which is a line that actually forum members don't vote on, that we have to fund regardless of the amount that is allocated to it. So that's set on the current amount for that now, and then the remaining amount has been divided between the school admission function and the retained duties to support with the cost of staff pay awards in those areas. So the decision for forum is around allocating that funding to the local authority in line with as set out on table 8. The other part of the centrally retained block is the historic commitments. So the decrease, sadly, in that is set out in table 9. So the government are continuing to reduce the funding that the local authority receive for historic commitments by 20% each year. So these are commitments that were in place before the move to the national funding formula. So the funding for that is decreasing by 20% each year. So the proposal from the local authority is to apply that 20% reduction equally to the different areas that the historic commitment funding currently funds, as set out in table 10. So the responses from the consultation, 12 of the 13 responses were supportive of this approach. And as a school form approval is required on a line by line basis, as set out in those tables.
If those historic funding things are not funded in this way, how are they intended to be funded in the future?
Sorry, that's the question you were asking. So if historic commitments is reducing.
So there will be decisions for the local authority in terms of how they provide those services. So these budgets are small proportions of broader services and broader budgets. So they're not the entire budget for the service. As I alluded to earlier, local government's under significant pressure budget-wise, and so the additional pressure that causes would need to be considered in the round of the local authorities' priorities and budgets. And so whether the kind of savings that may be required will feature in this area or other areas, overall we'll need to balance our budget. So it creates a pressure for the local authority, and we'll need to take a view on how that is managed in the round of our children's services budget.
Because these are all important areas. They may be small proportions of the funding for them, but those areas are not trivial, are they? So yeah, as ever, not enough money. Thank you.
Okay, so we need to agree that item. Is people in agreement? Yeah, thank you. So moving on to item that was 9.
10.
10 is
So that's it. So the final item, that's the decision-making items completed. So the final items are items for noting. So the item 10 is noting the composition of the notional SEN budget. So this is set out on page 29 and 30. So I should try and make these tables stay on one page, shouldn't I, rather than go over 2 pages. So the notional SEN budget is the amount of funding within the schools block funding that schools receive that's notionally intended to set out to cover the costs of meeting the first 6K for children with SEN. It's not a separate budget, so it's an identified amount within the maintained budget, and the notional SEN percentages are effectively intended to be a kind of a guide to how much of that funding funds that area. The proposal is that there's no change for 24-25, so this is the percentages that have been in place for a number of years now. Going forward, there is an intention by the government to standardise the calculation of notional SEN budgets. As I say, in practice, it doesn't make any difference to the amount of funding schools receive, and our current notional SEN proportions are very much in line with the sort of examples the government have set out in their funding guidance. So we wouldn't expect that to be a very, very different to the current position once that does, if and when that does come into play. But yes, it's just an item for noting. And then we've also covered, as Tamara alluded to earlier, the level descriptors project and the approach for reviewing the funding arrangements for special schools, additional resource provision in mainstream schools, and where we are with that process. The item 11 is noting the progress around the implementation of the balance control mechanism. So you'll forum members will remember that the decision came to forum in June about, it was July actually, July, about whether to implement the mechanism, and forum members voted that we should implement the mechanism for 22-23. Our finance colleagues have then crunched the numbers on that and taken account of the balance form commitments, and there were 3 schools that were then written out to who are potentially subject to clawback, and those schools have been given the opportunity to respond, and then there's still a conversation with those schools to have about whether we take forward those the clawback. So we'll update forum further on that in January. The other area around the balance control mechanism is that we included, following previous discussion at forum, we included a additional question in the consultation this year about whether whether schools were minded to retain the current balance control mechanism, so continue to have a mechanism that's focused on those schools who have built up excessive and increasing balances over 2 consecutive years, and also that whether it should continue at the current sort of incremental levels. So there was some feeling from some forum members that those incremental levels could increase, and or the mechanism could be focused on not just on schools who are increasing and excessive over a number of years, but over a shorter period. The responses that came back from the consultation, so 90% of the schools felt that the balance control mechanism should continue to focus on, so should continue to have those current elements to it. So focusing on the excessive and increasing, and applying at the current incremental rates. The comments in support of containing them were around stress the sort of uncertainty of current school funding levels, the 1 year funding agreements that we have, the uncertainties around salaries and grant funding, and the importance of schools having kind of notice rather than to avoid kind of wasteful spending. And then there were also points raised about the importance of being nuanced and seeking to understand the reasons why schools were holding its excess balances, which has and will continue to be our approach following the forum decision, that will hold those conversations before actually applying the mechanism. But yeah, from the responses that have come back from schools, there isn't an appetite from the schools that have responded to make changes to that mechanism at this stage.
Okay. Erin, have you got a question?
Yeah, so going back to that discussion where you were talking about the clawback, and you said you were having going back to consultation with those schools who are on clawback. What's normally the practice about that, and how have you gone about, once you've had the discussion, what tends to happen after that if they're not, fully with the clawback? How do you deal with that?
So most schools subject to clawback aren't fully supportive of the clawback. So there's usually a bit of a debate about calculation of the clawback and the impact on the school's viability. And so we've discussed at previous forums the local authorities approach. Ultimately, if we took into account everything and forecast into the future, every school would be in deficit and we'd never claw back anything. And so the approach is, really looking at those commitments, but also the impact of the clawback on the school's financial position. And so more often than not, the clawback remains at the level that's set out in the indicative allocations or an adjusted level. And so that discussion is continuing and hotly debated between the local authority and schools. We're aiming to be as consistent as possible. It's a really challenging conversation, and each year the school's subject to balance clawback mechanism usually changes. So we're starting afresh, which is good, and it means the schools that were subject previously have come out of the mechanism, and for a range of reasons it's had the desired impact. But I think it's you cannot please everyone, and the schools that are subject to the mechanism are likely to not be pleased with the clawback.
So can I ask a question? And feel free to give as concise an answer as possible. So is there any potential, given that in the finance returns at the end of this term, there should be a projected outturn, that the schools forum in January would have any idea where potential surplus is heading? Kind of an approximate or a notional figure, so that I always think we come to this after the fact rather than being proactive with it, because it is now a requirement to give a projected outturn.
Yeah, so we introduced last year and have again this year collected from schools a in-year monitoring position. So as at the end of October, the finance team is still chasing a small number of schools who hadn't made that return, but I think they're largely in now. There has overall, I mean, there are some schools have increased their balances in year. A lot of schools have reduced their balances in year. But I mean, I looked at a couple of days ago based on the schools that were in at that stage, and I think there was something like a £1.5 million reduction in balances overall from the schools that were in at that stage. But
is it possible to give some headline figures?
So the intention would be to bring those headline figures to the January meeting. And yeah, so we've got a sort of early informed form position of what balances are looking like. Some of those, the figures that schools provided at this stage last year were quite different from the final position. So one of the things we're sort of working with some of the schools around that, and so it will be an indicative position based on what schools have submitted. But yes, we will bring that to January forum.
Erin, is your hand still up? Is that
Yeah,
right?
I just had one more question, which was about PFI agreements. Do you get involved with that, or is that something separate that the school has? Because that seems to be like that's where the money is being wasted.
I'll leave that to you.
Thanks, Kim, for leaving that to me. So there are a relatively small proportion of schools that are PFI schools. And there are two main elements to the PFI funding. There's an element that's fully funded as part of the funding formula, that schools receive an equivalent amount to the cost. And then there are the costs associated with the services provided by the PFI provider. So services that schools would ordinarily need to provide, like cleaning, catering, etc., those are chargeable. Where schools, particularly schools with falling roles, those schools who are PFI have less direct control of the changes that may be associated with maintaining a sustainable budget. And so we work with those schools and the PFI providers to understand where there is flexibility. PFI contracts are not as flexible, and essentially the school's context is changing, and the PFI contracts tend to be relatively rigid. And so those conversations are ongoing, and we're in dialogue with the DfE and the schools that are particularly affected by falling roles and PFI costs. I think it's there will be different views about waste. So the budgets for the kind of the core costs are fully funded for schools, although they appear in their budgets. Schools get full funding for that. And the costs associated with the services provided are benchmarked across the sector, and they're set on the basis of the benchmarking. But people will have different views about the value for money associated with some of those services.
Okay, thanks. And then just the final note, note 12, Kim.
Yep, so the final note is noting and any comments on the arrangements set out in the report, which the council consult school forum on annually. So it's consultation on financial issues around SEN funding, funding for PRUs and EOTS, early years, and administrative arrangements. So these are largely as they've been. So there's no major changes to those from what we've set out previously. But yeah, any comments from schools on that? Those.
I think ironically, that's probably one of the most important things to note following this meeting is that the comment on the arrangements set out in the report is for members to actively encourage engagement with consultation, and to, I think, if ever there was a moment or a meeting when that message came across strongly, this is it. And we just need to take that forward. Okay, I think that's us done with. Thank you for all your valuable contributions. A good debate was had. And the next meeting is in January, the 18th of January. Hope everybody keeps warm. Good night.
Thank you, Chair.
So, bye now.